So this time around we want to test or write a route that tests this function, ValidToken. And this is a really simple function, as you recall. All it does is it takes a plain text version of a token, it gets a user for the token, and then it makes sure that token hasn't expired, okay? So what we need to do is to go over to our routes.go, and we'll just write a really simple handler here, or route here, with a handler inside of it, mux.get, and I'll look for /test-validate-token. And I'll inline the function, the handler. So a response writer, get there eventually, and the pointer to the request. And what I'm going to do is write this such that I can just append a key and a value to the end of the URL. In other words, a query parameter. And Go makes it really easy to get a query parameter. So I'll call this token to validate is assign the value of r.url.query.get, and I'm going to look for token. Okay? So that gives me the token I want to validate. So now I'll store the result in valid, that's my variable, while checking for an error when I call app.models.token .validToken. And all that requires is the string, the plain text version of the token, which is token to validate. And I'll check for an error. If error is not equal to nil, then I'll say, this time I'll write a valid JSON response. app.errorJSON is just about the same length of code, so I don't know why I haven't been doing this right along. W an error, and I'll return. So, assuming we don't get an error when we call that, we're going to get a result. But the result will say either this is a valid token or this is not a valid token. So let's create a payload response, var payload of type JSON response. And we'll set its values like this, just to see what the result is. Payload dot error. And in this case, all I really care about is whether or not there was an error when we called it. So I'll just make that equal to false. Okay? And here's the part I want to look at. Payload.data is equal to valid. And I will just write that out. App.writeJSON, and I'm going to write to the response writer with the status http.status_OK, and I'm going to hand it payload. So let's try this out. So I'll restart my application, make restart. Then I'll go to my database and grab the plain text version of a token from the tokens table right here. So there's one, and that shouldn't have expired because it hasn't been 60 minutes since that was entered. Now let's go to our web browser, and we'll change the URL here to test validate token, and then I'll put a question mark, token equals, and I'll paste in that plain text version of a token and see what we get. So I'll hit return. So the message is expired token. So there is an error, and the message is expired token. Well, that doesn't make sense, or at least you wouldn't think it makes sense. And there's a reason for this error. That token should still be valid, as far as I'm concerned, because I issued it about 12 minutes ago, and it's good for 60 minutes. But if you go back to Beekeeper Studio and look at the tokens table structure, so I'll right-click on this and choose View Structure. Expiry is set to timestamp, and I need to change that to a timestamp with the time zone embedded. The reason that it shows up as expired is it's comparing what's stored in that expiry, which is a timestamp, but that doesn't have the time zone information embedded into it. And I happen to live 4 hours different from UTC time, so I'll never have a token that's valid unless I make it at least 4 hours and 1 second long. And if I did that, that token would still only be good for 1 second. So let's just change its type to timestamp with time zone, like that. And I'll apply this. Okay. Then I'll go back to the contents of my tokens table, and I'll delete this row just to get rid of it entirely. Okay. So I'll apply that change. Now I'll come back to my web browser, and I'll say localhost 8081 / test-save-token. And that puts one in there. Now I'll switch to the database, refresh this to see the most current data by clicking the refresh button down here. And I'll get this token, copy it, go back to here, paste in that new token, and hit return. And everything is fine, okay? So the token is valid and I have no error. So that's an easy mistake to make, and if you were setting your tokens to expire in 24 hours, you might never actually notice that. So it's a good thing I set mine to 60 minutes, and I did that quite deliberately just so I could show you the correct data type for the expiry field in the tokens table. In any case, I think we're almost at the point where we can actually go write a real handler that allows us to connect our front-end Vue application with our back-end Go application. Now, there's other things we haven't tested yet, but we'll get to those when we write real integration tests in a little while. So let's move on.